think we're rolling. So, hello everybody. We're back this week after finally getting done and finished with our succession of presidents videos. Now, as we kind of move away from Lincoln, before we would really go back into that, I don't want to really do them all back again. So, I want to try to hit some other topics that are not presidential related, since I think we pretty much spent a whole month on that, and I think that was more than enough to catch up. But today, I wanted to take a moment to discuss a little bit of not so much a major history topic, but it's a relevant history topic to what it is now. And it involves, of course, the ongoing war that I'm pretty sure if you've been anywhere near a news outlet or if you've been anywhere in civilized society for the past month, as of today, officially a month, then you have probably known about the ongoing war in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians who have invaded under Vladimir Putin's orders, purely out of basically a desire in all part. Putin's desire is to pretty much destroy, he wants to pretty much destroy Ukraine. He pretty much wants to incorporate them into a renewed Soviet empire, whether or not the guy is willing to admit it or not. And the Russian people here are not at fault. They are victims of this. They are victims of this monster that has pervaded Russian political circles and gained power and now holds almost absolute authority. So, in this instance, we're going to talk just a little bit about the history of mostly Ukraine, but kind of focusing on its shared history of Russia. That's what I wanted to discuss today. Is just Putin claims, of course, that the whole purpose of his war, part of the reason, at least to him, is that Ukraine is part of Russia, that it is an essential part of Russia. They are one people. That Ukraine is not a country. It doesn't really exist. Well, I don't know what's stood as a big old state since 1991, Vladimir, but sure, I guess it don't exist, even though it's been on the map for like, I don't know, over 30 years. But apparently that don't matter. I think 40 technically now. I'm trying to think here. Yep. No, it's been 30, over 30 years. No, is it? Yeah, it is. It ain't 40 yet. But I just wanted, because it's a relevant topic, a lot of people, of course, I mean, we've traced since 2014, we know about the ongoing conflict that had been in Ukraine between Russia and the Ukrainians because we knew about Russia's invasion of the Crimea back in 2014. And of course, we kind of knew about that. We had known the situation existed, but a lot of people don't really realize that Putin's words, although they're in no way true, Ukraine is its own language. It has its own language, has its own culture, has its own people. There's a very distinct Ukrainian identity. They're not Russian. Russians and Ukrainians are not the same people. They have a shared history, yes, and you can have a shared history and still be two different cultures. But Ukrainians have their own distinct culture. They have their own distinct identity. And this is something that I think Putin really does not take into account because of his ignorance. Putin's only goal here is to recreate a Soviet empire in the best way that he can possible, which is part of the reason why he wants Ukraine back, because Ukraine was a former part of the Soviet Union. It was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It produced most of the country's grain, food, food staples that it needed. Ukraine was the breadbasket, and he wants that back. That and for a couple other reasons. But we will discuss that. So, kind of going back, Ukraine and Russia really, they do have a shared history, which Putin is right on that aspect. However, Ukrainians, unlike Russia, where Russia kind of sees it as, oh, it's been mutual, we're the same people, Ukrainians don't see it the same way. The people of Ukraine kind of see it as they kind of see it as a history of Russian domination of themselves, where they've really been restricted over where they could really express their cultural identity. They've been dominated by Russia for a lot of their history, and this is something that modern generations of Ukrainians kind of want to break away from. The shared history can be traced back to over 1,000 years ago, and this can be traced back to the state of Kievan Rus, which was the first Slavic state in Eastern Europe. It was the first official Slavic state. And of course, it's centered in the modern day city of Kyiv, which is the current capital of Ukraine, which I'm still trying to pronounce that word right. I used to say Kyiv because Kiev is how I used to say it because apparently that was how I was initially taught because how it was spelled was Kiev. Here, I'm gonna write this down so you people can see this. You might have noticed it in the past weeks anyway. Up until recently, I was still spelling the capital. I was still calling it Kiev, and I was spelling it in the old way that I had seen, like on my globe, which is probably a little bit outdated. That's how I'd always spelled it. Was Kiev. Apparently, that is the Soviet, old Russian style Soviet spelling of the word, and it's not in any way Ukrainian. So, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine decided to change the spelling of the capital and asked that other nations do the same to the closest English translation to what it would sound like if you translated Ukrainian into English, and it would look like this. This is how we're supposed to spell it now. It's Kyev. And apparently, instead of Kiev, the way I've been told to pronounce it, the way I've looked up and trying to see these people who are trying to pronounce the word like professors from Ukraine and everything else, is Kryiv. 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 I'm still working on the pronunciation, so pardon my grammar if I do not pronounce it right. I am trying to use the Ukrainian spelling now. I'm definitely trying to get that fixed. Even though it sounds like there's an R in there, but there's no R in the word. But anyway, Krivian Rus was the first Slavic state and encompassed a large part of territory between that modern day encompasses much of modern day Ukraine, much of Belarus, and of Russia. And this was the first official Slavic state. Now, officially at its start, Krivian Rus was a pagan state. It worshipped its own Slavic gods and goddesses. The Slavs are an ethnic group of people, just in case we don't know that are dominant in Eastern Europe. These Slavic peoples are like the ancestors of the Ukrainians, or the ancestors of the Belarusians, or the ancestors of the Russians. And this was their first official political state that they established by the 800s. Initially, the capital of Kievan Rus was at Novgorod, but that eventually got moved to Kyiv later on. In 988, the Prince of Novgorod and the Grand Prince of Kyiv, Vladimir I, he accepted Orthodox Christianity as his faith, and he was baptized at the city of Kirnesus and the Crimean Peninsula. This was a game changer for the Slavic state that it was, as beforehand they had been pagan. They worshipped their own gods and goddesses. They didn't really identify with major religion. After this point, when their ruler, Vladimir I, becomes an Orthodox Christian, he not only does he become an Orthodox Christian, but he kind of makes Eastern Orthodox Christianity as the official state religion of Kievan Rus, which quickly comes to dominate many of the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. And to this day, Eastern Orthodox Christianity is the dominant religion in Russia, and it's one of the two dominant religions in Ukraine. And this brought Christianity to Ukraine, to what would become Ukraine. It was this decision by the Kievan Rus ruler to do that. Now, Kievan Rus thrived until about 1240, when it was eventually invaded and conquered by the incoming Mongols out of the east. Yes, the same Mongols that had Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. These are the same Mongols. They came and actually conquered what is now modern Ukraine. They ended the Kievan Rus state. Now, by the 1500s, the Mongols are gone. They've been pushed back pretty much out. And Ukraine, what would become Ukraine, is invaded from the west this time by the Polish and Lithuanian armies, who clash with the Tsardom of Russia, which is emerging in the east, for control of the region. Now, the Ukrainians by this time have developed their own culture, language, and identity. That this very same thing that while Putin claims, oh no, we're the same people. No, you're not. You're completely doing what the Soviet Union did and wiping away the fact that these people have their own cultural traditions, they have their own language, they have their own identity separate from yours. But you entirely disregard that because you are an arrogant, pompous fool. And I hope to goodness Putin watches this. Even though I know he won't, but I hope to God that if he ever watches this, I just want the bastard to hear it. Yes, this video is going to be a little bit uncensored because that Hitler in waiting. No, he's not even a Hitler in waiting anymore. He is he's the new 2022 Hitler. He's pretty much the 21st century Hitler. That's pretty much what he is at this point. He's an idiot. He is an absolute idiot, moron, bastard, devil, whatever you want to call him. But anyways, by the 1500s, Ukraine is invaded from the west by the Polish and Lithuanian armies, who pretty much establish control over most of what will become Ukraine for the incoming century. Now, by the 1600s, the 17th century, there are multiple wars that begin appearing between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is pretty much the merger of Poland and Lithuania at that time, who control most of Ukraine, and the Tsardom of Russia, who effectively starts trying to conquer parts of Ukraine and incorporate it into its empire. Now, the Russian Empire ended up incorporating the eastern part, east of the Dnieper River, which I'm hoping I'm saying that right, Dnieper River. And the eastern part of Ukraine comes under Imperial Russian control by the end of the 1600s, and it's called the left bank. The left bank of Ukraine belongs to the Russians, while the right bank, the west side of the Dnieper River, continues to remain the western Ukraine, continues to remain in Lithuanian and Polish hands. Now, in 1793, the Russian Empire annexed the right bank of Ukraine. They eventually annexed eastern Ukraine into the empire. And upon that annexation, the Russian Empire engaged in what was called Russification, where it banned the use of the Ukrainian language and study of it, and it pressured people to convert to Russian Orthodox Christianity. It basically was trying to wipe out Ukrainian culture and make the people more Russian. Pretty much, you could not speak Ukrainian language, and if you're caught speaking Ukrainian language, you're thrown in jail. If you are caught studying or teaching it, you're thrown in jail. If you do not convert to Russian Orthodoxy, you will be punished. It was basically an attempt to incorporate these people into the empire, but by forcing them to not allowing them to retain their own cultural identity and traditions, they had to conform to Russian ones. Which is something contrary to Putin's claim where, oh no, it's been mutual friendship. No, it has not. Russia has forced crap on Ukraine for far enough. And just so we might know a little bit where we're looking at here in the world, just in case you don't know, because I know some people don't watch the damn news. I see that every day, which scares me. How the heck are you supposed to know what goes on in the world when you don't watch the news? You all have cell phones. You all have cell phones. I know you're on the internet, you're on social media, whatever. And newsflash, social media is not a major news outlet for reliable information. I don't care if you got to go to Fox News. I don't care if you got to go to CNN. I don't care what you got to go to. Whatever your political view is. But those sources, even though they'll be politically biased in one form or another, they're going to be far more reliable than some hootenanny tweeting Twitter tweets off his toilet. He's probably half high on crack. But in case we don't know, because I know half people don't watch, Ukraine is right here. I'm going to get this pulled up. That is Ukraine. This is Europe. And this is Africa. This is Asia. I say that because some people don't even know that. Right here's Ukraine. Of course, right here's their supposedly big brother who just wants to be friendly, but right now is really just being the big bully and aggressor. Mr. Russia. I got a better map of Ukraine on paper, though, so that way we don't have to keep looking at the world. That's just to show you where it is in the world. Oh, And I should point out that on my map, part of the reason I had such a problem trying to change my pronunciation of Kyiv was because on my globe, it's still spelled in the old Soviet fashion. This globe is only about 10 years old. That's why I still pronounce it that way and spell it that way. But anyway, we come to the point by 1793, the Russian Empire has complete control of eastern Ukraine, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth pretty much dominates western Ukraine. Now, this is going to come into play, and we're going to see this because of the factor that this plays a role in Ukraine today, because a lot of the pro-Russian separatist people in Ukraine are in eastern Ukraine. A lot of the people that speak Russian in Ukraine are in eastern Ukraine. They're not in western Ukraine. Most of western Ukraine, there's hardly anyone that speaks Russian in western Ukraine. It's mostly Ukrainians. And part of that is because eastern Ukraine was under Russian dominance a lot earlier than western Ukraine. They kind of got incorporated more into Russian society faster and longer than the western Ukrainians did. And because of that, when Ukraine became independent again in 1991, you left a legacy where the eastern half of the country was pretty much somewhat culturally similar to Russia, but not entirely, while the West was very much all Ukrainian culture, nothing to do with Russia. And this kind of divides eastern and western Ukraine, kind of almost in the sense that the North and South were divided here in the United States up before the Civil War. Now, World War I comes about in 1914. This will mark the end of the Russian Empire, and Russia engages with the Allies, with France and Britain, against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And there are many battles and campaigns that take place in western Ukraine. For example, the battles in Galicia and the Brusilov offensive in 1916. Now, the Russian Empire collapsed in March of 1917 when Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate his throne, and it ended the Russian monarchy. Upon the breakout of revolution in Russia, Ukrainians declared independence for themselves, as many other regions of the former Russian Empire did as well, such as Finland, who still retains its independence. But Ukraine declared independence upon the Tsar's abdication, and declared independence and proclaimed itself to be the Ukrainian People's Republic. It was recognized by the provisional Russian government under Alexander Kerensky, who took power after the Tsar's abdication. However, in October, Kerensky's provisional government was overthrown by Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik communists, who very much did not recognize the Ukrainian People's Republic, claiming that it was still part of Russian Empire, which is pretty much what he wanted to continue. And this kind of it exasperated tensions between Ukraine and Russia, and then you had the I'm trying to think of the word here, the untimely disadvantage that in Ukraine there were Ukrainian communists that were sympathetic with the Bolsheviks and very much started to pretty much form their own Ukrainian Soviet guild or Soviet Little Workers Commission or whatever it was called. Yeah. But they very much, Ukrainian communists get to a point in Ukraine, they start organizing and start growing to the point that civil war breaks out within the Ukrainian People's Republic that established itself in 1917. By 1921, those same communists, along with help from the Bolsheviks, are pretty much in power in Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't help, the People's Republic didn't help itself, that it also sided with Poland during the Russo-Polish War in 1920. And of the neither side really won. Poland really beat them, but Poland did not keep Ukraine, and because of that, Russia was kind of keen to punish the Ukrainians even more intently. So by 1921, the Ukrainian People's Republic is kind of forced into submission, into becoming another Russian client state again, and in 1922, it is one of the founding original republics, one of the original Soviet republics, when the Soviet Union is formed in 1922. And Ukrainians suffered during the initial first few decades of the Soviet Union. They really suffered throughout it all. Anyone that was a Soviet citizen, unless you were one of the high elite class, did pretty much. But during the 1930s, Ukraine suffered immensely under the dictatorship of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Stalin forced many peasants in Ukraine to join collective farms as part of his effort to collectivize agriculture in the Soviet Union. And Stalin also orchestrated a famine in Ukraine that ended up killing millions, what the Ukrainians today refer to as the Holodomor. And some nations, including Ukraine and the United States, before all this happened, have recognized as acts of genocide against the Ukrainians. Stalin kind of planned this famine. He kind of planned for it to take place, and when the many numbers of Ukrainians started to die off, he pretty much brought in Russians and other Soviet citizens from the east to repopulate the areas in Ukraine that had been hardest hit. Now, here's the catch that also contributes to today. The area of Ukraine that was the hardest hit by the Holodomor was eastern Ukraine, right where Putin has these two separatist republics set up that he claims are independent, that did it on their own, even though he's backed them every step of the way and kind of encouraged them to do so. They didn't absolutely do so on their own ends. They've had Putin's backing and Putin's support to do it. But anyways, the Holodomor hit eastern Ukraine the hardest because eastern Ukraine is where a majority of the agricultural farmland is in Ukraine, as most of western Ukraine is actually timber forests. And because of that, this is also happens to be eastern Ukraine, where Stalin is sending all these Russian citizens in to resettle the area. He's sending all these ex-Ukrainian peoples into Ukraine to settle in the eastern part of the country, which contributes to the discontent between East and West today. He's making that eastern part of Ukraine even more friendly with Russia. Now, eastern Ukraine came under Russian rule more directly than Western Ukraine did, as Western Ukraine wasn't even all Western Ukraine yet until 1939, when the Soviet Union, under its Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, kind of divided Poland, and when the Soviets took their eastern half of Poland, they pretty much gave a good portion of that to Ukraine, and as part of Western Ukraine. Ugh. I'm trying to make sure I got everything here. Which means that you have this divide by the 1950s, pretty much, by 1940s, of Eastern Ukraine is very different from the West. Western Ukraine is more Ukrainian speaking, and it's more Catholic, which was brought in from Poland. And then you have Eastern Ukraine, which is much more Russian speaking at times, and more Eastern Orthodox in its religion. Now, during World War II, millions of Ukrainians ended up being killed during World War II when Nazi Germany invaded in June of 1941 due to Operation Barbarossa. Millions of Ukrainians were massacred as the Nazis came in. Some just out of, general war crimes, others out of the fact that they were Jews, and of course, the Nazis were still exterminating them just like back home in Poland and in Western Europe. They pretty much were doing the same thing there. And Ukraine suffered immeasurably during World War II. And that's something that's even referenced today. And it's kind of insulting that Putin would even say initially that, oh, there's Nazis running Ukraine. Have you realized at all that these are not Nazis? Why would they want to be Nazis? They suffered probably the most out of anyone out of the Nazis. And need I remind Mr. Putin, that's kind of insulting, given that President Zelensky, he's Jewish. He had family members that died in the Holocaust. That's insulting to them. And does Putin look at the facts? No, he makes up these wild claims and lies to basically, in his mind, rectify and justify his actions, even though it's a false claim. Now, in 1991, the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. On Christmas Day of 1991, the Soviet Union officially ended, and Ukraine declared its independence. However, like many Soviet states during the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine did suffer a massive recession to its economy that did hurt the country financially. It did not join, however, the Commonwealth of Independent States that was led by Russia, that Russia established in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. That most of the former Soviet states and republics joined to keep their ties to Russia. Ukraine was one of the few that did not sign that agreement. It did not choose to rejoin that. In 1996, Ukraine came up with a new constitution, and it was officially turned into a semi-presidential republic, which created a stable political system for the country and a new currency to replace the ruble, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Ukrainian currency. I'm sorry, but I cannot even try to pronounce that. But you can look it up. Starts with it's spelled Hryvnia. I don't know how to pronounce that. And then one of the most striking things that happened during the 1990s with Ukraine was the factor that they inherited the world's third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons, because a large portion of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was in Ukraine. Ukraine declares independence in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses. Those armaments, those weapons are still in Ukraine. The problem with Ukraine was they didn't have the ballistic missile technology or anything capable of really launching the weapons. They just had the weapons. They didn't have nothing capable of delivering or launching them to a target. So they agreed in the late 1990s to give up their nukes, one of the few nations to ever do that. And they gave most of them up I'm sure they regret it now, and I'm sure we all regret it now. They gave them up to Russia as part of agreements between Russia and the West, with security guarantees included that if Ukraine gave them up, well, we won't do this. You'll be assured this support or this protection. Yeah, how well has that worked out? Because nukes act as a great deterrence. I mean, they're horrible, yes, but they also act as a major deterrent. Now, in 2004, presidential elections in Ukraine are held, and they conclude with the Prime Minister Viktor Oh, I'm going to say this right. Yan- Yanu- Yanukovych. Viktor Yanukovych was declared the winner of the election in 2004. Now, he was a pro-Russian politician, but there were allegations that the election was flawed, that it was rigged, and the Ukrainian Supreme Court eventually came out and ruled that the results were a rigged election, and that Yanukovych did not truly win the election, at least not in a fair way. The public started to protest in support of the opposition candidate of Viktor Yushchenko, who opposed and challenged the results of the 2004 election. Now, Yushchenko eventually ended up becoming gravely ill, almost to the point of death. He ended up living, though, and it was discovered that he had been poisoned. And there, of course, was suspicion that because Yanukovych was a pro-Russian politician and thus favorable to Putin, that Russian involvement may have been involved in the poisoning of Yushchenko. The people in what was called and referred to in Ukraine as the Orange Revolution of 2004, they cast Yanukovych out of power. They forced him out of power, and they brought Yushchenko in with the Orange Revolution in 2004. He is put in as president. Now, Yushchenko did serve for president as a couple of years, but Yanukovych did not disappear off the political scene. He regained his position as prime minister in 2006, and eventually, due to recessions that happened in Ukraine in 2007 and 2009, respectively, he eventually wins the presidential election in 2010 in Ukraine. All of this is happening at the debate of NATO and the European Union, and of course the ongoing East and West tensions that are starting to develop at this point, because Putin is making it surprisingly clear that he's not this reformist leader that he initially set out to be in 2000. He is very much an autocrat, a dictator, and he's taking Russia in a backwards direction. By 1991, when the Soviet Union had fallen, NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a organization founded in 1949 by a collection of Western nations to defend themselves against Russia, against Soviet aggression in Europe, pretty much, it had expanded to include many former Soviet bloc states that had been dominated by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, such as Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. All these states got admitted into NATO after 1991. And even three former Soviet republics were admitted in the Baltics: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This angered Putin's government. He sees he sees NATO as a threat to him because he claims that, oh, they're going to invade Russia. they're not going to invade Russia. The problem is we know that you're a dictator, we know you're an autocrat, and we are going to do anything that we can to restrict your movement. And you don't like NATO because not because it's going to invade Russia, no, but because you know you can't go risk going to war with NATO and not go to war with half the world. And you also know that they effectively restrict any aggressive action of you which you just hate. That gets in your way. Now, the Ukrainians desired to join NATO, the alliance, because of course it has that efficient and important article of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which basically states that an attack on one nation is considered an attack on all. So, unfortunately, I don't want to scare anybody, but if Putin goes and extends the war beyond Ukraine, say he attacks one of the Baltic states who are NATO nations or attacks Poland, they're NATO nations. Not only would Putin be going to war with them, but by charter obligation, every other NATO member is at war with Russia. So even if he don't attack the United States, if he attacks Estonia, then he's going to war with France, he's going to war with Britain, he's going to war with Germany, he's going to war with Norway, he's going to war with Slovakia, he's going to war with Italy, he's going with Turkey, Greece, the United States, Canada, he's going with a whole bunch of them. Because an attack on one member is considered an attack on everybody. And this is what I think Putin fears. And of course, you have the economic alliance of the European Union that starts emerging in the early 2000s that also the Ukrainians themselves desire to join and become a part of. They want closer ties and relations with the West. They want to break away from the shadow of Russian dominance that had been present for centuries. Well, Yanukovych, who is a pro-Russian politician and a Putin puppet, really doesn't want to do anything. He really does not want to get closer with the West. He desires the opposite way. In November of 2013, there had been an agreement that was being negotiated between the European Union and Ukraine to formally, I think it was a trade agreement or whatever that came up. But in November of 2013, the government of Yanukovych began moving away and officially canceled any further talks on the matter, on the trade agreement with the EU, and they instead sought closer ties with Russia. This was what his government wanted. This was not what the Ukrainian people wanted. And Western Ukrainians in particular began to protest to show their desire for increased Western relations immediately following this announcement in November of 2013. Revolution eventually broke out in February of 2014, and I can remember this happening when Yanukovych, in an attempt to rein in the protests, passed anti-protest laws, much like Putin has in Russia, and this sent Ukrainians over the edge. The Ukrainians rose up in rebellion. They occupied Kyiv. They occupied the government buildings. They occupied the police stations, almost anywhere that the government had any authority. And Yanukovych was forced to flee Ukraine, and he actually ended up fleeing like a little baby back to Russia, back to his big old mother Putin. Yes, he's a mother because he's a woman. He is a woman. He's not a man. No, he's not even a woman. He's a monster. That's put it plainly. He's a monster. He's a monster. But Yanukovych is forced out in the 2014 revolution. And this angers Putin. This worries Putin because he realizes that although he had a Russian puppet in place in Yanukovych, the Ukrainians just got rid of their pro-Russian president because they don't want to be pro-Russian. At least most of the people in Ukraine don't. That's not to say there are a couple groups of people in eastern Ukraine who might be more sympathetic, and in the Crimea, which had long ago been given to Ukraine by Russia, like back in the 1950s, I think, technically. But had been a part of Ukraine ever since. Putin's worried because now he has a country that shares a large border with Russia. It's right on Russia's doorstep, and it's not only wanting to increase Western relations, it wants to become part of NATO, and it wants to become a part of the European Union. Thus, he would have a NATO nation right on his border that's a major country that he wants to kind of take back secretly. He wants to gain back for both its food capacity, for both its monumental population capacity, and for the capacity that could give a warm water port to Russia, which has always been one of its foreign policy goals, is to gain a port for its naval ships that does not freeze over at least part-time during the year, which Russia doesn't really have a port that does that until after they invade the Crimea in 2014 at Sevastopol. Now, Putin worried about this new pro-Western government that got established in the wake of the 2014 revolution in Ukraine. And in March, Russian troops crossed into the Crimean Peninsula under the pretext that they were in there to support Crimean rebels. And there was a controversial referendum in which supposedly, and this was probably not true because this was highly rigged, 97% of the people in the Crimean Peninsula wished to be annexed by Russia, wished to be annexed as the Republic of Crimea. Now, Russia, of course, automatically annexed Crimea, but the UN and other world powers never officially recognized the annexation. Neither did Ukraine, which the UN labeled that the annexation was invalid, along with the referendum, but any enforceable resolutions that it could pass were vetoed and never came to fruition because Russia has a place on the Security Council and is a permanent UN member, and it passed its vetoes. Following the Russian invasion and annexation of the Crimea in 2014, you had separatist militia in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine who started to arm themselves, and they began to seize control of government buildings, police, and cities. And this happened with Russian provocation. Putin and his Russians encouraged them to do this, gave them arms, gave them supplies, gave them money, basically encouraged them to do this and say, oh, you can do this. Go ahead. Here's some free guns. Go and seize power of your regions. And they held unrecognized status referendums in which they declared the independence of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Of course, Ukraine never recognized this, automatically dictated that these people were trying to secede from Ukraine and went to war with the militia rebels. Russia, of course, painted it in a different light, saying that, oh, these are valid results, these are valid referendums, you should respect it, and we're going to get involved if you don't. So in 2015, a ceasefire is negotiated by the UN that ends the fighting temporarily. However, as we just seen this last winter, things finally went over the hedge. For the past couple of years, things have just kind of been at that tedious point. And now we have, in November 2021, Russian forces began building, as we saw, on Ukraine's border massively, while Putin was adamantly denying that, oh, no, we're not going to invade Ukraine. We're not planning to do that. You lying son of a blank. No, I'm just going to say, you lying son of a bitch. Because I honestly want that guy to hear that if he ever hears this. But Putin lied to our faces. Just like I knew he was. I knew he was lying. But I can't believe that there were some politicians and people out there that, oh no, he's telling the truth, including Donald Trump, for God's sake. My God, the guy, Donald Trump, even just days before this happened, literally says, oh no, he's keeping a peace operation. That's so great. He's gonna work it all out. Are you that naive? This guy has done this before in 2004 with Georgia. Under a pretext of a peacekeeping operation, he invades Georgia. But then again, this is one of the dumbest men I've ever seen on national politics, so I can't say I was surprised. But regardless of the American people, Putin starts building up. We know he's lying. That happened in the fall. Then we've seen as come January that he starts to put out demands saying that NATO needs to revert to its 1997 borders. It needs to stop expanding. It needs to guarantee that Ukraine's not going to join NATO. I see it as a threat. And of course, we did not agree to that. We started building up our troop presence in Eastern Europe and our NATO members. And then, of course, right before the invasion took place, he's doing military drills in Belarus under military drills, even though it was a preparation to basically use Belarusian territory to invade Ukraine. And then we had February 21st, just last month, where Putin basically recognized both of those separatist republics officially and sent troops in that peacekeeping operation. But then, just like we predicted, invaded the country 3 days later, or a month ago today, as part of what he called a special military operation to denazify Ukraine. If anyone's the Nazi here, it's you, Putin. You're the one that has brought war to Europe in its largest scale capacity since World War II. You are the one that is committing war crimes in Ukraine by targeting hospitals and civilian residential buildings. You are the guilty party here. I don't even hold the Russian people in contempt because they don't even know what's going on. Not entirely, because it is so well hidden from them. They are victims of this monster just as much as that. And of course, I'll go about in this, like, some of them will be arguing, oh no, Putin's great, you guys are the angels. Well, who told you to say that? Putin? Because you're hearing any news that you get, guess where it's coming from? Him. You're not hearing the outside truth. You ever notice how he blocks everything for you? Or has that not become obvious? Putin started this war. I mean, it's still ongoing. It's been a month as of today, and we just see it continuing. I think they estimated there's been at least 15,000 casualties on the Russian side, at least. The Russians have not, they failed. This offensive has failed in Russia. It's stalled completely. They cannot take Kyiv, and not the Russians, the Ukrainians, I just heard last night, officially started launching an offensive that actually regained some of the ground around Kyiv that officially kind of pushes the Russians back a little bit. But Russia started this war. This is not Ukraine. Every statement that Putin has said about Ukraine at this point is a flat out lie to mask his own insecurities and his own failure and his own secret reasons for wanting the war. He wants a renewed Soviet empire, and he's willing to do almost anything he has to do to get it. Right here we have a small little image of a map of this was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This just shows the territory they covered, and as we can see, most of western Ukraine was occupied by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the 1600s. Eastern Ukraine was part of Russia. Here we got a picture in 1920 of Polish troops in Kyiv during the 1920 Polish Russo-Polish War, right when Ukraine was its own republic for that brief period of time after the Russian Revolution and eventually before it got forced back. Picture of the capital of Kyiv during the 1940, I think this is 1941 if I read it right, but this is 1941 Kyiv after the Nazi Germans bombed it and destroyed the whole city pretty much. And then we got a map here of just modern day, pretty much modern day Ukraine. And where's a pen here? I got a pen. I have it. How well we're going to see this. Right here's the capital. Of course, up here is Chernobyl, where the nuclear power plant that exploded in 1986 is, which I covered in a separate video a while ago, but we're not really focusing on that today. Port of Odessa, which the Russians did attack. Right here's the Crimean Peninsula. This big, looks like an island, but it's actually a peninsula. This is what Russia annexed in 2014 that really kicked it off. Then over here in eastern Ukraine, you have the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist republics that Putin claims are now independent, even though they were never officially recognized by any nation except for his own, which does not mean that they're independent. That just means that one nation recognized them. They're still part of Ukraine. Of Kharkiv over here, the major city that's, to my knowledge, still being kind of surrounded by the Russians. You have Kherson here, Lviv, where I think a lot of the Western embassies have moved. Western Ukraine is over here has really gotten out of being invaded. But then we also mentioned the dividing line is really this river. It's really the Dnieper River, which runs pretty much almost through the heart of Ukraine right here. This is the Dnieper. And here's eastern Ukraine. This was dominated by the Russians during centuries ago, while this part was dominated mostly by the West. And that leads to that division of Ukraine. That pretty much, I think, covers for this little topic video. This was just something I felt needed to be just kind of discussed because of the history of this situation that has really come to dominate the global news system right now, global attention. I mean, everything's getting affected from protests, gas prices, everything. It's just useful to know a little bit more about it and see how that is connecting to today. So I hope to goodness gracious this freaking bastard loses that war. I hope that someone actually takes him out, honestly. I wouldn't be too sad if he gets assassinated. He needs to be. But yeah, we need to continue to stand with Ukraine because they are really the victims in this conflict. Russia can play victim all at once, but it's really the aggressor. I know, and Russian people can go on YouTube, they can go on anything they want to and try to decry this. It will not change my mind, and it won't change the minds of anybody who sees the facts. But I even hold the Russian people in not in contempt, but I hold them to be victims as well because they're literally getting lied to daily and they don't even know it. But that concludes for today's video, and I don't know what our next one's going to be on, but we'll hopefully get to that next week. So as always, like, subscribe, any questions, concerns, whatever it may be, in the comment section below. Any suggestions, as always, glad to take them. And that wraps it up for today. So have a good rest of your week, and may God bless you all.